So our next teacher has a BS in electrical engineering and computer science from UC Berkeley. He's the CEO and co-founder of Edge, a non-custodial exchange and security platform. And that also works for blockchain educations, and it's won accolades in all sorts of fields, including being one of the top Bitcoin mobile apps, receiving first place at the Inside Bitcoin in 2015 and Coin Agenda shows in 2016, both winning their pitch competitions, and being voted in the top 50 fintech companies to watch. Please help me give a warm welcome back to Paul Puey.
All right, cool. Thanks a lot, everybody. We are talking about blockchain forks today. It's not quite the season of forks, but it might come at any moment, at any time, and on pretty much any chain. And why I really like giving this talk is because it's actually a pretty fascinating phenomenon that for the first time ever in history, we're able to take money and fork it. Now, we've kind of experienced different kinds of forks in the technology space, but the idea that you can take a money and compete with it, but utilize a starting pool of users that already have that money, now have a new currency. That's effectively what's happening in the landscape of, especially like in 2017, early 2018, when various chains such as Bitcoin, specifically Bitcoin, and even earlier than that, Ethereum, were forked into two different currencies. So let's talk a little bit about it. But actually, before we start, I'm going to have a bit of a workshop. So if you have a computer, definitely get it set up. And I recommend having a mobile wallet on your phone, a mobile Bitcoin wallet on your phone. Of course, we build one. Edge.app is one place to get one. And I'll be working through a couple to give you examples of kind of things to do in the case you encompass or run across a fork while holding some currencies. So have one installed on your phone and get your laptops ready. And who was here, by the way, for my talk yesterday on mining? Did you all come back to get more money? Is that why? So we'll get your wallets ready then. All right. So what exactly is a fork? If you're not in the computer science field, you probably think it's something to eat with, or it's something that the road does. But in software, we think of forking as just simply taking a block of code, a code base, and literally copying and pasting it and making some changes. Outside of the world of software, such as writers and publishers, it's called plagiarism. Literally, take my writing, copy it, change a few words, make it the way you like it, and then publish it as your own. But in the open source world, this is widely known, and it's accepted, and in many ways, it's actually encouraged. We call that kind of a code fork. And this is what happened when Bitcoin was kind of plagiarized, in a bad term, but in a positive term, just simply code forked into other currencies, such as Litecoin and to some degree Zcash, and actually almost 100+ others. They're code forked. But the network of Bitcoin didn't really change, and the assets that were on Bitcoin stayed as they were, unchanged, and you basically just built out a completely new currency by code forking Bitcoin and changing a few parameters. Example with Litecoin, they changed the parameter of how frequently blocks are produced. Remember in the mining course yesterday, I mentioned 10 minutes. Every 10 minutes a block is produced, someone solves the Sudoku puzzle. And in Litecoin, it's every 2.5 minutes. This is something that we've already been able to do in the terms of monetary competition. Someone could say, yeah, I kind of like the idea of the dollar, but I'm going to make the Aussie dollar. I want to make the Hong Kong dollar. Rough equivalent, they have different values, and when you start that other dollar, you effectively have a different pool of people. You have to issue it from scratch, from the ground up. And everyone that has the US dollar does not have an Aussie dollar by default. In terms of blockchains, we have two kind of forks that we talk about a lot. One's soft fork, and one is a hard fork. If anyone was around a year plus ago when Bitcoin implemented SegWit, this is a rule change into the ecosystem. That was what was considered a soft fork, and I'll cover that a little bit. Most of what we'll talk about today is actually what's considered a hard fork, where a currency significantly diverges, and you end up with two different currencies with a common ancestry, such as probably the most popular known hard fork was Bitcoin Cash, and after that, Bitcoin SV, or Satoshi Vision. So what exactly is a soft fork? If you remember the mining rules, the mining class yesterday, if everybody here in the room was playing a game to compete against each other, and then they yell out their answer, what if it wasn't Sudoku we were playing, and instead it was bingo? And there's a certain set of rules in bingo, right? Someone yells out a number, and you kind of stamp whether you got that number into brick. But you need to get 5 across. You don't need the free space in the middle, but as soon as you get 5 across, you yell out bingo. And we could be all over the world, and we just yell out, I got bingo. And maybe it reaches the destination, maybe it doesn't. But that's how you'd effectively win. But what if we tightened the rules? What if half of the room suddenly said, we're going to create new rules to bingo, and we're going to tighten them. We're going to say you can't use the free space. So one half of the room, if they end up getting a bingo that uses the free space, they just will effectively ignore it. They're not going to yell bingo. The other half of the room is still on the old rules. They haven't upgraded yet. And every time they get a bingo with a free space, they yell it out, but everyone on this side doesn't listen. Right? You're just yelling it out to the world, and they're still going and stamping the different numbers. They're not even listening to you. Like, that's nice. That's nice. And eventually someone wins, and it could still be someone on either side. But you effectively tighten the rules. You've created a smaller subset. So the people that are on the old rule set are still accepting of the answers that people on the new rule set give. So every time someone here solves the problem, the people in the new rule set, they never include a free space. They pass it out to the world, and everybody says yes. I'm okay with that. A hard fork is when you actually soften the rules, and you say, we'll actually accept more answers than before. An example of this is, what if we took bingo and we said, you don't actually have to go 5 across, you can actually go 4 across now. This side of the room has the new set of rules. We can go 4 across. This side of the room is on still the old set of rules. You have to go 5 across. So whenever the new rule set side publishes an answer, the other side says, that's not valid. No. I'm still playing the old game. All your stuff's invalid. So now you have a very noticeable divergence where people here are playing bingo with their set of rules, and they now have their list of blocks that follow the old rules, and the other side has their list of blocks that follow the new rules. So while you can still have divergence in either a soft or a fork, it's generally considered that a softening of the rules has a higher likelihood of creating significant divergence between a network of people playing the game, right, of mining against each other. So types of hard forks. In essence, if we soften the rules and create the potential for a hard fork, what if everybody adopts the new rules? What if the whole room upgrades their software, their mining software, and we say, sure, we'll take the new rules? Well, you don't get a split. There's no split in the room. Everyone's just going ahead and saying, sure, 4 blocks across, and bingo's just fine, and we're all in the new rules. But in a distributed, decentralized network that's global across many jurisdictions with many personalities, very likelihood there's going to be some disagreement. And hence what occurs is effectively a chain split. And that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. So if there's no split, well, it's just kind of an agreement. And this has happened repeatedly in the past, even in Bitcoin, where the change of the rule, the softening of the rule, ends up being fully agreed on because maybe it's a bug fix. But when it's a feature, some people call features bugs and bugs features, then you end up with a split. So what happens when you have a split? Let's take the example, let's say we wanted to hard fork the US dollar. The best analogy is you take all of the banks and all the payment processors, and you say, I'm going to copy the balances that everybody has on all the banks. And I'm going to create a new currency and give them the exact same numerical balance, but with a new currency associated to it. So if you had a balance of $1,000 on Bank of America, you now have 1,000 Paul dollars on Bank of Paul. Does it mean it has any value at all? But you got 1,000 Paul dollars. Now, anytime you make a transaction from Bank of Paul and all the other banks and, Chase, JP Morgan, Paul, and whatever, you're making transactions and spending Paul dollars, and ideally you're not spending the US dollar. And if you receive in the future some Paul dollars, you're not necessarily receiving US dollars. That's effectively what we built or experienced, because this was almost accidental. We didn't realize the ramifications of this when Bitcoin and Ethereum were forked, that we've created two financial systems, two currencies, but with that common ancestry. That's kind of that weird, unique thing that we've got with blockchain forks. But that creates a very interesting ramification, which is this slide called replay attacks. If we change some rules that create the fork, if we don't change the way you spend money, such as writing a check, what happens if someone takes a check from their JP Morgan Chase, photocopies it, and tries to deposit it in JP Morgan Paul? Without any changes to the network, it literally spends both. It spends money on both networks. This is called a replay attack, and on almost every fork, somebody is taking all the transactions they see on the old chain, on the old network, and because they look exactly the same as transactions on the new chain, or they might, they just broadcast them. The signature is already there. All the information that makes a transaction valid, the source amount, source account, destination account, all of those are valid on the new chain. I can just copy and paste that check. So hence a replay attack. But we don't really consider it so much an attack anymore because it's almost guaranteed to happen. Someone's just going to run a little server, take every transaction and copy it and paste it onto the other network. And so people have to be very careful that when they're sending a transaction on either one of the networks, they're not actually sending both currencies. And this is probably the bulk of this talk, is what do you do as a holder of crypto in the case that you have the potential for a replay attack? So there's kind of there are two ways that a new implementation, a fork, a new currency that forks off from Bitcoin or Ether or any other currency can implement ways to prevent replay attacks. And as we call these replay protection. One is what's called mandatory. You're like, well, how do you implement mandatory replay protection? Mandatory simply means you're sure that any transaction that is valid on the old is invalid on the new, and any transaction that is valid on the new is invalid on the old. Opt-in is where you have a subset. There's a bit of overlap. You can make a transaction that's invalid on the new, but you can also make one that's still valid on both. So a good analogy to this is that, remember that check that we have up top? You're probably really familiar, we're in the US, so you're familiar with that good old-fashioned check format. Signature on the bottom right, name, amount, and memo field on the left. That's the old chain. But what if when I created the Paul dollar and forked and copied all the different banks and I had JP Morgan Paul and Bank of Paul, I said, checks must have the signature on the bottom left. Must have them. Otherwise, they're completely invalid. That is effectively a change to the transaction format, making sure that we have now mandatory replay protection. And anything spent on the old doesn't work on the new. Opt-in, as I'd mentioned, is somewhat of a blend. And it allows, as an example, a new chain can say, you can actually put the signature on either the left or the right. We'll accept either one. And so here you kind of have to be careful. Old software that was designed to work with the previous changes, say Bitcoin, would create transactions that could kind of work on the new one. And this is a classic example where you may want to wait for software to be updated to make sure that if you're making a transaction, it actually spends funds specifically for the chain that it's on. This is opt-in. This was actually what was implemented when Bitcoin SV had forked off from Bitcoin Cash, and it didn't happen immediately. At the moment the chains forked, there was simply no replay protection at all. And if you spent on one chain, there's a very high likelihood that you spent on another. So the Bitcoin Cash hard fork, I kind of like jumped ahead of my own slide, but they did implement that mandatory replay protection. So this made it fairly easy and safe. Now, the one thing to note about a chain that implements replay protection is from the viewpoint of forking and monetary competition, they're effectively almost bowing down and saying, we're going to be the other new altcoin. The entire ecosystem of payment processors, wallets, and exchanges that are compatible with the old are not compatible at all with the new, and they have to rebuild out that ecosystem once you implement this replay protection. So SegWit 2x, this was a proposal to increase the block size of Bitcoin, was going to need to loosen the rules. If you remember, loosening the rules would be a hard fork. The rule being how big of a block of transactions could a miner include. And in doing that, had a possibility of sufficiently causing a chain split. And it had no replay protection. Many people ask why. Well, it comes down to the purpose and ideology of the changes being made. If the changes being made are an attempt to create a new coin, separate from the original, then replay protection is ideal, right? You just protect people's funds, there's no crossover. But if there's just a fundamental disagreement on what a chain should do, what rules it should have, how big its block size should be, what kind of transactions are valid, and one side that implements the change thinks we are upgrading the network. We're not creating a new coin, we want to upgrade the network. And the other side says, no, we don't want to. Then you have this absolute butting of heads. And hence, no replay protection because they felt like they were the coin. They were Bitcoin. And the same thing happened. This SegWit 2x was a proposed hard fork of Bitcoin. And then Bitcoin SV, as we know it now today, was a proposed upgrade to Bitcoin Cash. And so Bitcoin Cash to Bitcoin SV had no replay protection initially. And then after a while, they said, okay, we're just going to go and be our own coin, and implemented some Optin replay protection opportunities. So, tip, what do you do in case a fork's going to happen? When you know and you've heard about it on the news, listened to CoinDesk, like, uh-oh, these people are proposing it, and it's kind of making the headlines. Number one, own your own keys. When you own the private keys that hold the old funds, you at least, even though it might be really difficult, you have the ability to use those private keys to extract out the new funds. Basically, the private keys are your wrist to sign that check. That allows you to write that check to deposit into Bank of America and the Bank of Paul. If you don't have that wrist, then effectively the bank, the custodian, the exchanges, the Coinbases, or any hosted wallet, they make that decision for you. They decide whether or not you have any right to the new currency. And in all honesty, it's incredibly, incredibly hard for them to actually give you that new currency. And I wouldn't blame them at all if they simply said no. And for many currencies that have forked from Bitcoin, they absolutely did simply say no. Like, sure, it's there, it's in the keys, but we're not going to give you access to it. When you signed your terms of agreement, nowhere did it say that we'll give you access to every single fork coin that happens out of the funds that you've held with us. So first step, definitely own your own keys. Number two, and this one gets a little bit more detailed into how to make it easier to extract money. Who here is unfamiliar with the term an HD wallet? No, everyone knows. So the concept of having multiple addresses. Not all currencies implement HD wallets. Ethereum, Tron, Tezos, a lot of them are just a single address. One private key and you've got an address. Bitcoin, Litecoin, Dash, Bitcoin SV, Bitcoin Cash, a lot of them implement, or wallets typically implement rolling addresses where they change the address, which means that you may have funds in many different addresses. And the standard by which you can move those funds from maybe the wallet that you currently have that holds your Bitcoin and use those keys in another wallet that now supports the other chain, the new fork chain, your ability to move those across can be very difficult because there's not a good standard. There's some standards by which you move the entire list of private keys over, but not super consistent. So one of the things to do, realize this does give up privacy, is spend all your funds into one address. You simply take your wallet, it probably has an address sitting there when you go to request money, copy that, and then just simply spend all your money into that address. And it'll sweep everything you had in all your prior addresses and put it into one address. And the good thing about this is that after a fork, you have only one private key to deal with, not hundreds of private keys, just one private key. And for the most part, single individual private keys have been very compatible across different applications. And so this is one tip. So quick demo on how to extract a private key. I'm going to fire up my phone screen share here real quick. And I'll cover two different apps. Of course, I'll be a little selfish and cover Edge, but I'll also cover one called Trust Wallet. So launch the app. So in Edge here, I've got a bunch of different wallets. And in Edge and a few others, some only have one master private key, and you don't really have to deal with multiple. In Edge, there's multiple, one per wallet. And I'll take simply the Bitcoin wallet on the right side, tap the three dots, tap master private key, enter my password. Simple demo account. And there you go. We happen to use a 24-word mnemonic. It is a standard in the industry, but some use 12. Anywhere from 12 to 24 are standards in the industry. So there's no money in this. Don't bother writing it down. It never will have any money. This isn't where you win any money in the class. But that's, at least for this app, how you would take out a private key for a specific wallet. Go now to, this is another multi-asset wallet called Trust. It uses one private key to deal with multiple different currencies. Here I go, settings, wallets. I tap the little eye on the upper right of the wallet that I want to extract, and then simply show backup phrase. And there you go, they do 12 words. So these are just ways that various wallets will allow you to see the master private key if it is a non-custodial application. But it could be different. Generally speaking, you're looking for backup phrase, backup mnemonic, master private key, things like those words within settings to be able to get access to that private key. Now, one thing to note, the reason why I'm showing you this is so that you can get access to a private key that did hold your old funds, so you can put that potentially into a new piece of software that supports the new chain to be able to extract out the new funds. But it can be hard to determine whether or not you can trust that new software with your private key. So one thing to really note is, after a fork happens, to take out the funds from the old chain and put it into a new private key. So you swept it into one private key. That makes it easy to extract the new funds. But before you take out that private key and put it into another unknown wallet developed by who knows who out in the middle of the internet to support some Bitcoin pizza fork, go and spend your actual real Bitcoin or whatever funds it was off into a new wallet. Basically say that wallet is deprecated. Right? And then, only then, do you want to take out the private key. Now, we were talking about the mnemonic. Now, that itself isn't one private key. It's potentially many. And you just swept your funds into one of the keys. So how do you actually find one of those keys? This is probably one of the most common support calls we get at Edge, is how do I claim my funds off some random fork, and how do I get my single private key that I want that has my funds, or several. Some people didn't do that first step where I said sweep all your funds. They have it in 100 addresses. So if that happens, how do I get those individual addresses to put into this new software that supports the fork? So here's where you get a chance to win some money. Here's a 12-word mnemonic, and it has a handful of private keys. If you go to this website, bit39.edge.app, it actually forwards to another site. And it allows you to put in a master private key and see all of the private keys in it. So I think I've already done that on this screen. So napkin, screen, and wasp. This is what you should see when you go to that bit39.edge.app, is this Ian Coleman Bit39 site. And if you punch in the private key into that Bit39 mnemonic field that I just highlighted, see if I can zoom this in a little bit. There we go. Punch that in there. You will then see at the very bottom, well, first there's this thing called a derivation path. Different wallets support different paths to go from one big key to all your hundreds of keys. Typically speaking, if your wallet shows a 1 address, like at the very beginning of your address in Bitcoin, I'm going to talk specifically about Bitcoin, but it just gives you a good muscle memory in case you have to do this with another coin. But in Bitcoin, if you see a 1 address, that's typically the Bit44 path, and you can see the different addresses down here. If the wallet shows a 3 address, typically, not always, but typically that is a Bit49 derivation. And if it shows a BC1 address at the beginning, that's typically a BIP84. But we're going to stick with a BIP44 derivation here. And so you can see all the addresses below. And so what you can do now is actually take this address and punch it into a block explorer, such as Blockchair, to see if it has any money. Oh, that one has no money. And just keep going down the line until you find the address. If you actually remember the address that you swept all your funds into, you can kind of do a visual search and find out where that is. I don't believe this tool lets you literally search for a string, so you have to kind of go down the list until you find that address that has your money. And then once you do, the private key is on the right side. So a couple of these keys, not too far from the top, actually have some funds in it. Has anyone found any funds in any of those keys? Nobody? Once you do find the funds, if you hover over the private key, you can use wallets that will allow you to sweep the private key to send the funds into your wallet. In this case, I only sent Bitcoin, so we're not actually going to go and try to sweep a forked coin. Oh, sure.
Can this page be run on an air-gapped computer?
You'd have to copy the code, and it is standalone. So yes, you can run this on an air-gapped computer. Yep. So for added security, not accessing an outside website is a general benefit. But either way, still highly recommended that you take your original coins off first. You sweep them off into a different private key completely. Create a new wallet with a different mnemonic, sweep your funds there, and then deal with the old funds. The new funds, right? The new chain, the forked coins after, whether it be air-gapped or on the site. But yeah, yep. Okay. For the most part, of course, different things can change. For the most part, we've utilized the site for people to extract keys, and they've had no issues. Cool. All right. So, has anyone found any funds? Nobody? Nobody? Well, make a note of the words. The funds are over there, and then you can use Edge to actually scan the private key, and that'll sweep the funds into your wallet. This is how you go and derive individual private keys from that backup that you see. Cool. So another tip, if you experience a fork with no replay protection, such as the Bitcoin Cash to Bitcoin SV, just don't move your money. Don't move your money until the wallet provider, the software provider that's providing your wallet, lets you know what to do. Because even though there might not be replay protection, there's frequently ways that the wallet itself can implement an aspect of replay protection. This is a bit of a technical implementation and technical description, but the way that wallets are able to do this is that once the networks have diverged, there can be some transactions that uniquely occur only on one chain, such as when a block is mined. So as we know, transactions, these checks that we deposit into the bank, they're not just simply removing funds from an account, they're removing funds from a previous transaction. And so if that previous transaction was only on one chain, then it's inherently invalid on the other chain. So funds that a miner receives on one chain, once those funds get spent, the following transaction, even though it might look like one valid on the other chain, isn't. And that's one way that, and many wallets have done this, implemented opt-in replay protection, even if the protocol didn't. And over time, this ends up actually diverging the networks, and replay protection gets built in, is you end up with these pool of transactions that start from miners. Those spend money, and then that money gets combined with other money in a transaction. As you remember from my talk yesterday, a transaction on Bitcoin and similar currencies can source multiple different accounts and spend to multiple different accounts. Well, if one of those source accounts, and addresses came from a miner's money, then that entire transaction is only valid on the chain that miner mined. So over time, the networks start to really diverge, and replay attacks become less relevant. But definitely hold your money, don't spend it until you hear from the wallet provider. Like in the case of Edge, we implemented an aspect of replay protection. You took your Bitcoin Cash wallet, you hit a button, and it spent your money in a few different ways to split the funds and keep them replay protected. And one really, really big thing, and this is one of the also big support calls we get due to forks, is be very, very aware of address similarities. So if a chain forks, there's an address format that may still be identical to the previous fork. You scan that address or you copy and paste an address. As an example here, these are 3 different address formats that are completely valid on the network. On Bitcoin, an address that starts with a 1, an address that starts with a 3, or an address that starts with a BC1. And in Bitcoin Cash, the top 2 are perfectly valid as well. A 1, a 3, and then Bitcoin Cash implemented a new one that starts with a Q. So be very mindful if you're going to send money to an address that you are sending it to an actual wallet. Like if you see your friend's wallet, make sure that is their actual Bitcoin wallet or their Bitcoin Cash wallet that you're sending to, and it's coming from the same currency. Otherwise, you might be sending Bitcoin to their Bitcoin Cash wallet and Bitcoin Cash to their Bitcoin wallet, and similar for other forks. The new currency code, specifically for Bitcoin Cash, the Q format, was introduced to kind of alleviate this confusion. And so many wallets will give you a warning. If you have Bitcoin Cash and you send it to an address that starts with a 1 or a 3, they'll give a warning and say, warning, 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 this is kind of a legacy format, and this new chain has adopted a different format. Do you really want to send to these funds? Are you absolutely sure? Because many wallets that may support Bitcoin Cash haven't actually upgraded to the new address format. So we still have to let you do it, but you got to really warn you before you do that. So easily one of the biggest support calls we get. And for some period of time, if you did this, if you specifically sent Bitcoin Cash to a 3 address in Bitcoin, you could just simply lose it, fully burned. If you send it to a 1 address, and the details of why that happens is a bit complex out of the scope of this talk, but realize if you send to a 3 address, it could easily just be fully burned. If you send to a 1 address, you'd have to go to this rigmarole to recover it. Basically take your Bitcoin wallet, put in the mnemonic into this website, find the private key that you sent the Bitcoin Cash to, take the private key out, and then use it in a Bitcoin Cash wallet to sweep the funds. A lot of rigmarole. We end up having to walk people through it. We've got a blog post on what to do, but definitely not convenient, and potentially compromises your funds by having to pull out a private key and punch it onto a website. So address similarities, be incredibly mindful of, and it's probably one of the biggest dangers long term. After the replay protection and whatnot, and things have settled, this still ends up being an issue. And I don't have it in this slide, but specifically Bitcoin SV has, even though they forked from Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Cash had a new address format, they are rolling back, the community is rolling back to identical addresses to Bitcoin. Their decision, not one I personally like. It creates more havoc for us with the potential for people to lose money. And we wouldn't be able to put up that warning anymore, like warning, this isn't a real Bitcoin SV address. Well, actually, in their mind it is. So be aware of that. And this can happen to many other currencies as well, Ethereum and whatnot. So probably the biggest thing to look out for in a fork, I think. And that is it. So hopefully I gave you a good overview of forks as a whole and in general. There have been a few. There's potentially many more to come. I think as the both the plus and the downside of cryptocurrency is that because it's so decentralized, many people have access to it, but because it is also so decentralized, there are a lot of people that have a say into the way it progresses forward. But as you know, in humanity, there's no way to get all of us to agree. And this is the outcome of that. With choice comes disagreement, and with disagreement comes a lot of the havoc of disagreement. But keep yourself prepared, own your keys, and hopefully in the next fork season, if it were to happen again, you guys are all prepared. Thanks a lot. Happy to take any questions.